Hello, and welcome to COVID Confessions. This episode, we interview Jordan Tyler and Brian Johnson, both teachers at Upper Mississippi Academy. The two of them are our humanities teachers, and we've really enjoyed having them as our teachers for the past 2 years. The interview turned out really well with a lot of great topics coming up through the conversation. This is one of my personal favorites, so I hope you enjoy. Hi, we are here with our teachers, Mr. Tyler and Mr. Johnson. Hi, guys.
Hello.
If the both of you will go Tyler first, then Johnson.
You gave them an order.
Yeah, look
Wow.
at me. If you could give us your name, pronouns, and relation to the school system.
Sure. My name's Jordan Tyler. My pronouns are he and him. My relation to the school system is I've been a teacher for 8 years.
How long have you been teaching at UMA?
3 years.
And my name is Brian Johnson. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I have been teaching for 13 years.
Wow.
And this is my 4th year at UMA.
I had no idea you were teaching for 13 years. That's a
I
long
look
time.
so young.
It should be switched, really, right, if we're going by looks.
You guys answered how long have you been working within the school systems. Prior to COVID, how did it feel to work with students and other staff at your school? I guess maybe for you this will feel a little bit odd because you came from somewhere else, I think, but...
Yeah. So COVID happened in the middle of my time at Woodbury. So that was kind of interesting because, as you said, I just started a new job at a district school, and I hadn't worked at a district school for, 4 years. But I would say things felt pretty normal. I think we were talking a lot more about, at that time, about things like cell phone use was kind of like the real hot button like topic at that point. But otherwise, really everything went on as normal prior to COVID. So yeah, felt usual.
Nice.
So I was in my first year at UMA, teaching you two as little baby freshmen.
Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
right.
When COVID started.
I didn't realize, I didn't tie it in my head that that's when you started too.
It was a little weird for me. Well, the question is, how were things before COVID?
Yeah,
Yes.
before.
It's a little hard for me to judge in terms of were things normal because it was my first year at UMA, and UMA is a weird school.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
Right? We
Yeah.
do things really differently. The population is really different. I don't really remember what big issues were during that time, other than it's still an issue, and I don't think it's necessarily related to COVID, although maybe it's worse now. Attendance on community days, right? That's a really unique feature of community days at our school, and the big topic I remember that year was just how do we get students and families to be invested in this thing that we think is really important and really cool, that I think is really easy for students and families to view as a fun add-on that's not that important, and my kid can actually just work on Fridays instead.
Yeah.
When that's not what we want.
Yeah.
And we still face that a bit. I actually think it's getting a little bit better, and we're taking some strides, but I don't know. I think things felt fairly normal during that year.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
How did, I guess this is just from my own curiosity, but how did UMA compare to the other schools or school that you teach/taught at?
I've worked at really different settings all along. So I started off in a big public school, 1,200, 1,800 kids.
Oh my God.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Unimaginable to people like us.
Yeah, I mean, I was in a history department with 12 teachers. So we had a shared office that was an entire classroom. We all had a desk in that room.
Oh.
So there was that. That was my first 2 years. And then I went and worked in wilderness therapy for 6 years, where I had literally a one-room schoolhouse.
Wow. Yeah.
And it was just me.
Mm-hmm.
And then I worked at a different charter school in Minneapolis, but it just had a super different vibe. Very different population, and very rigid and strict and kind of by the books traditional.
Yeah.
And then here, so I don't remember the question anymore.
No, it's okay. It was just like, how does it compare?
It's very different.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've always said about UMA is just that I think the student population here is like some of the nicest kids I've ever met.
Really?
Yeah. There are, pros and cons to every place, but that's always been my big one. It's like you guys are just like a genuinely nice group of kids here.
Aww.
Yeah, I was just saying to Mr. Bulander yesterday, because we both come from Minneapolis public schools at some point in our career, that it's weird to not be breaking up fights every week.
That's the middle school's job now.
Yeah, I remember at my last school, I had mornings where I would break up 3 fights before the first bell rang.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
That sounds a lot more like the typical like high school movie.
Yeah.
Like you've got your fights starting in the hall, and you got all the kids trying like fight, and the teacher's like stop.
Absolutely.
Kind of when COVID started, how did the school initially kind of react to that? Tyler, I know it's you
your
probably
respective
wouldn't.
schools.
Yeah, your respective schools like Woodbury, and then if you can speak to UMA at all.
Yeah, it was super weird for Woodbury because they're on trimesters, so that means their schedule is very weird to begin with. And we were on spring break, so I left for spring break and didn't come back.
Yep, that was our experience too.
Absolutely bizarre. So it was kind of interesting at the time because prior to COVID, me and another English 12 teacher had been working on an online curriculum for English 12 because we'd been losing a lot of kids to online schools. It's like, well, if we're going to lose them anyway, let's build our own program. So we were like, oh, okay, I guess we're going to test this out a lot sooner than we had planned to do. And it was pretty terrible right away. I think it's, I think we were very, optimistic at the beginning. I think we were like, this won't last that long, and there's lots of cool things that we can do. And I remember setting up my space, in my office in my home, and being like, oh, I'm going to get, I got a whiteboard from school, and I was like, we're going to do all of these things. Yeah. And that lasted for about 2 weeks, and then we kind of sunk into it. And so then what's interesting is I switched to UMA at the summer break there, got a job here. And we were optimistic then as well. And my first 2 weeks, which is when we do teacher trainings, we were in person. So I was in the building for 2 weeks, and I was getting set up to have you all in person. And then again, felt like 5 days before we were about to start, we announced that we were going to be online. And so I think that colored it a little bit too, of just having these different expectations and the reality being very different. And then for me, what became immediately a big struggle, the class where I had you all for the first time, was Intro to Project-Based Learning.
Oh, God.
Which
I
had
never taught before and knew nothing about. Yeah. Someone handed me a book about 5 days before.
Oh, no.
And so that was an interesting thing to be like, not only how do I teach English 11, how do I teach a class that has no business being online in any way. And it was a struggle.
Yeah. Can you just repeat the question for me?
Yeah. Well, how did the school react kind of initially when COVID hit?
Got it. Okay. So it was a little weird for me because, again, you might recall that I was actually out on paternity leave.
You were?
Yeah. So I left for paternity leave in February, and my daughter was about a month old, and I actually came back to school on an SRD day, on a day when students were not here, but teachers were, because the staff threw my husband and I a baby shower.
Oh,
so I brought my daughter in, and they gave gifts. We had a little party, and it was literally in the middle of the baby shower, a group of teachers gathered in the corner of the room upstairs, and we're the governor's announcing that we're not. He's shutting down the schools for the year, and so that was the last time we left the house for months. It felt like. And that was, I think, about 2 weeks before spring break. Yeah. And we basically said, all right, we're stopping school for the next 2 weeks and spring break so teachers can have some time to transition. Yeah. And I thought that was really forward thinking for UMA to be we're not, and I think a lot of schools might have done this. It wasn't just like on Monday we're going back the distance. Like we're shutting down school for several weeks to let teachers figure out how the heck to do this.
Yeah.
And then we came back after spring break. But again, I remember, I think initially it was like, well, this is going to be like a 10-day thing, right?
Yeah.
It's like, it's going to, you know, it's like, and it kept, and it was probably maybe halfway through the quarter before, fourth quarter before we're like, all right, like that's it. We're not coming back.
Yeah.
I think, you know, I think one of the strengths of UMA has always been that like teachers are at the center of really important conversations, and we have the autonomy and the freedom to make a lot of decisions on our own. And so I can't speak for the school as a whole, but as like a high school team at that time, we had a lot of conversations of like, what are we grading? Are we grading anything? And there was basically a lot of consensus at that time amongst our staff. It's like, you know what? Like the world's on fire. The kids just need to be taken care of. Like we're going to give them some time and some structure. And like we all agreed, it's like no homework. And we're really not grading anything. Like we want to, this is really more about like providing any sense of normalcy for students that we can in this online setting, and trying to figure out how to do some of our more unique programming online, which, you know, even though our more traditional program, that was all just a big failure. But I do remember really well that like UMA, at least as a high school teaching team, we focused a lot on just like, we just got to take care of kids right now. Like academics will come. And I think especially right when COVID first hit, that was the correct move. I do think that that UMA, maybe other schools too, maybe like stayed in that mindset for too long during the pandemic. And I think in that sense, there was like too much, I mean, like academic loss. It's like, I don't know, like, I don't really like that term, but I do think that because we focused maybe for too long on taking care of kids and not trusting that kids can be resilient, that we lowered expectations and damaged students and staff's like ability to think of kids as like able to face a challenge, both socially, emotionally, and academically.
I talked about literally in an interview that we did earlier today, I talked about how I almost wish that we had dropped pass fail earlier, because I felt like it provided too much of that, like, we're gonna like make sure that you guys are like okay and can like handle yourselves, and
there's a good amount of like coddling in the process. and he's smiling because we're reading Coddling of the American Mind.
Sorry. And it's like, that's exactly what it's about, you know? It's like I kind of wish that we had a little bit more pressure placed on us, you know?
I remember going to hybrid is when this conversation really came to head. Because it's one of the places where Johnson and I became close, because there was 5 of us in the whole high school. And we were doing everything for like 3 weeks. We had more after that. But the school had given, and like the whole thing about giving kids a choice was one thing, but the school had given staff a choice, because some staff were really against coming back into the building. And I remember like conversations of us having of like, it's scary, but we're here, we're masked, we don't have that many kids, we can space them out. We're vaccinated.
Teachers were the first to get vaccinated.
It was just like, and there was actually some frustration at some point against the teachers who just refused to come back from some of us who were here, because we were doing these classes where it's like, okay, the 8 kids who are here with me are having a real education right now, and the 10 who are still online are not. And that became very evident, like, as soon as we started that hybrid model, like, what the difference in that impact was.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
What were some ways that you both supported students during COVID, aside from, like, the pass-fail grading, and, there was a lot of leniency with, like, deadlines and such, but what were some, like, other ways that you guys, I don't know, tried to help students?
That summer, I took like a 16 or 20 hour professional development on how to create like an online classroom that both I mean, I guess that kind of did all the things, right? That was like still supposed to be somewhat academically rigorous, but also meant to be like supportive and creating community. Because I think in the education world, that was a huge part of the conversation, really all throughout the time of like distance learning was like, you know, a huge part of education is the social aspect of it, and to like allow kids to be social, and that's really important. And so how do you create community in an online environment? So, you know, like I took that class over the summer and learned, you know, some interesting techniques. I think one of the things that came across to me really strongly during that training that I tried to bring back to our staff was this concept of reducing cognitive load, which is basically this idea of like trying to make instructions simple, or really trying to make it so that you're not taking up students' brain space trying to understand what to do, and they can take their brain power to do the thing you want them to do instead of trying to understand the directions to do what you want them to do. So I spent a lot of time with organization and formatting and color coding folders. Like we've had a lot of conversation in our high school team about like similar language. Like we are using Schoology during that time, and it's like all of you, like, this is how you post a folder, this is how you post an assignment, this is the language you use, this is the format you use for your titles, so that we could, as a school, like if a student, whether they were looking at their like Schoology in human geography or in language arts 9 or geometry, like the format of their Schoology pages should have looked the exact same all across, so that students didn't have to figure out where to find stuff and how to find stuff. They knew the structure so that they could focus on like understanding the stuff. So I think to me that was a big thing that I focused a lot on, and part of that just represents like my brain and my personality of like I'm a pretty structured, orderly person, and so that's where I put a lot of my efforts into.
I remember trying a lot of things for community days. I don't think any of them were successful, but I think it was like a weekly conversation to be like, okay, that didn't work. What can we try next time? And I think a little bit when like that went along with advisories too. Where we were like, we're still going to have advisory check-ins in the morning in some way, and I think like. Those were both attempts to try to keep the community piece of it alive. Again, I'm not going to stand here and say it was successful, because it wasn't, but there was intentionality behind it. And then I think a lot of how do we build our classes so that students can access them as they would be as close as possible. So it's like what that came down to, if I'm thinking about like in English 11, like we're cutting out half the content. We're just not going to get through it. But the half of the content that we are doing, how do I like make it as close as possible to what I would do if we were in the building with the other half is what I would think about too.
Which turned into a lot of like, I learned how to like screencast, right? And like make a recording of myself or like, you know, so that students could... It was not all just reading, right? Like I learned in that professional development I did. It's like to as much as you can have videos of yourself, because there is, even though it's just a video, like if you as a student are watching a video of your teacher, that's a really different connection than reading the instructions that the teacher wrote.
Yeah,
you know?
definitely.
Yeah, absolutely.
How do you think that the school did during the pandemic, like in terms of just like a little wider, like supporting students and like handling things on the school side,
and like supporting teachers as well.
Supporting teachers as well.
Supporting staff.
Like how well do you think that the school handled that?
I think supporting teachers, I'll start there. I think our school does a really good job of supporting teachers for the most part, especially in terms of, I mean, it matters to feel like you're part of a decision-making process and not just being told. And that's one of the beauties of a small school, but also I think particularly UMA, we've created a culture that like I think it's as democratic of a school that you can pretty much get and not be a teacher-led school. And we've talked about moving towards that too, and that didn't pan out. and I'm not sure if anybody who's still here would still punt that. But it's a really democratically run school, and I think just that like taking that as truth of our school means that teachers are cared for because our voices are heard.
Yeah.
Right.
And as Mr. Tyler said, like there was a lot of like, are you coming back or are you not coming back in person?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think the whole reason why the high school didn't come back in person that first fall was because we didn't have enough staff who said, I'm willing and feel safe and comfortable being back in the building.
Yeah.
The middle school did. And so the middle school did come back that fall, but the high school didn't. And, you know, whether that was the right decision or not, I don't know, but it shows a lot of respect for the teaching staff to like tell the administration what they need and be heard.
Yeah.
And the support staff. I think the school could have arguably have been vindicated in saying, like, we are firing all of our paras because it like over COVID, just as a survival mechanism.
Yeah.
Because that's like how do you be a para in the online space? Like for everything we're talking about for like being a teacher, like we still have ways of giving direct instruction. Like how do you give one-on-one support like you would in a classroom? But we didn't. We held on to those people and we made new jobs for them and we put them into situations where they could try to help. And I think that was very supportive. And then just on the monetary end of things, which again matters, they made an exception for us for like if we got COVID, that was a different piece than like our sick days and our personal days. So that's huge because if you're out for COVID for 2 weeks and you only get 10 sick days a school year, then there go your sick days and suddenly you're not able to have mental health days or anything else that you need. During the school year. And that's continued to now. I don't know if you guys remember, but I was out the first week with COVID. And Amy said, hey, don't worry about it in terms of like time off. It's still part of that COVID piece. So that was massively supportive as well.
Yeah.
And they used some of the funding, you know, like all the schools got additional federal funding, and they used some of that funding to just like, hey, teachers, we recognize that you were like running on the hamster wheel right now, trying to figure out how to do this stuff. And we also understand that online teaching is not great. And like they gave us bonuses. I've never gotten a bonus at school before. Right? Like, so, I mean, like, I think they worked really hard to take care of staff. In terms of, was the other half of the question taking care of students as well?
Just like,
I think a lot more of that fell on the teachers, right? The conversations that we were having about like, how are we creating community?
I will say that from the English side of things, that I had to get books to kids. And I did very little of that work, which, so I will say that like the office staff and some of the support staff would do things like drive out to people's houses and give them like a packet of stuff that had books or Donner's experiments, or if they didn't have Wi-Fi at home, like Wi-Fi cards and things like that. So I think in that way, there was a lot of like really focused, organized support for students to try to get to where the teachers could try to teach them as well.
And some mandates that were meant, I think, for the benefit of teacher or for students, like we were mandated, at least at the beginning, like there is no such thing as late work. And attendance policy was super lenient. Basically, like our attendance policy was more or less like if we heard from you during a day, you were marked present for the day, right? Like if you reached out to me once in the morning and even said, "I hate you," well, I heard from Keat.
I would never.
Right. But I'm just like, you know, I think that was an effort to be like, we're not trying to like have any truancy letters sent home. We hear from a kid, they're present for the day.
Are there ways that like you wish, or things that you wish could have been improved during that time, like at least for you guys?
I think that, you know, it's all hindsight, right? Which is tricky always. But I think that, you know, I was still doing a section of 6 classes at the time like I normally would. I think maybe there would have been a space to cut down on that a little bit, or even combine some classes so that, you know, you had a couple more teachers in there. I don't know. It just felt lonely a lot of the time, and so it would have been fun to have had something like humanities, just so that, like, if nothing else, if no one else showed up, I'd have Johnson. But yeah, I think there would have been something to saying, like, hey, maybe we're just going to focus on core classes. Yeah. Like, I remember trying to teach film studies and being like, what am I doing here? Like, this is such an in-person visual medium that is just, like, cannot be replicated over screen sharing.
Or poor Ms. Beret trying to teach culinary.
Yes, culinary.
Yeah. I don't understand. What could have been better? Yeah. I mean, I do wish that we would have, that more of us would have been back in person sooner. I think that's the really hard place for our administration of wanting to respect teachers' decisions and feelings, and like notions of safety, and doing what students needed, which I think, and especially again, hindsight, right? Like what we're finding more and more, and the more reports that I'm reading is like it's pretty well agreed upon that long school closures were bad policy decisions. Whatever the motivation was, it seemed to have been more harmful than not. And so I really wish I think that, like, again, in hindsight, that had things been more like rigid in terms of expectations of returning after vaccines, then because, like, again, part of it for me is like I there was this sense a little bit of, like, at the beginning of the pandemic before vaccines, there's a lot of liberals condemning conservatives for not wearing masks and not listening to the science, right? And then after vaccines, it felt like there was still a lot of liberals who were, more or less being like, well, it still doesn't feel safe. Okay, but now you're not listening to the science. Is how it felt. And that's maybe not a very popular opinion, and probably particularly in the population that we work in. But I think there's an extent to that of, like, it felt like we cherry picked when we wanted to listen to the science and when we didn't, based on our feelings and our emotions. And I think that was maybe, what we're seeing now is that was to the detriment of students.
Right.
I think if we give a really concrete example of this, I remember in a meeting of us floating the idea of, like, for community day, let's just all meet in a park, or something. Do you remember this? And we were shot down with it. We were like, I was like, I'll drive to a park and meet students for the day. And I think a little bit that's related to that and to this question is, I think that I'm not sure that this definitely started before COVID, but it feels like there is this wild difference in parent power between now and when I started teaching. And I think that was part of what happened during COVID as well. I mean, you're talking about, like, liberal voices, and I think there are a lot of liberal voices in the school. I think there were a lot of liberal voices in the parents that were pushing some of the agenda that we ended up having as well. And I think that is, while I understand the desire to look after your child and get them the best that they need, sometimes those pieces can be overprotective in a way that can be damaging.
Yeah, absolutely. Have either of you noticed lasting effects on, like, students from the pandemic in either, like, emotional forms or academic forms, like just general, like, because you're both language arts teachers, so I can't necessarily ask you, like, how were math scores? But did you notice that there was, like, a lapse in ability or
just, like, even emotional state?
Or,
I'll start if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
I think what's scary about this is the impacts for us, for me and Mr. Johnson, are there and are only starting. I think that, so my partner is a 7th grade teacher, and watching what she is dealing with in terms of the learning loss is, like, really scary.
Yeah.
And those are the kids we're going to have in 4 to 5 years.
Yeah.
So she's got 7th graders who don't know how to read because they were online for 3 years, you know, during the moment where they would be learning how to read. And there's no replacement for that online. You know, we can figure out how to do large bits of The Handmaid's Tale online. I can't teach you how to read online.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's my scary end of that question is I think we'll definitely identify some things that we've noticed, but I think we're just starting with the long-term impact of that.
At the danger of being a little too specific,
It's okay.
You know, I think that there's something really to be said about levels of maturity for the students who are 9th and 10th graders. Or sorry, 9th and 8th graders.
Yeah.
You know, like you all were freshmen, and so you had 3/4 of a year of high school.
Yeah.
And I think that was enough to help like get you over that maturity hump and into like a high school mentality versus the class beneath you who were like didn't finish their 8th grade year and didn't have any of their 9th grade year in high school. Really started high school as 10th graders with like a beginning of the year 8th grade mentality and experience. And I think it continues to show. And then, you know, to an extent for the class beneath that as well, because they didn't have that experience of like being in 8th grade and like, I mean, I guess they had the experience of coming up to 9th grade, but I feel like this 8th grade's a pretty crucial year in terms of like, I don't know, just maturity. I mean, they all are, right? Like we all mature so much when we're adolescents, but to me, like, like I look at like our seniors and our 9th graders currently who like had a solid 9th grade experience. And our current 10th graders had a 9th grade experience, but it was still like everything was pass fail. You know, like we're all wearing masks. Like it was still like really weird coming back to the building at that time. Like it still felt very much like we're in the thick of this. Even though you're in person, like it didn't feel normal yet. This year feels more normal than anything. And and maybe it's just personalities of the different grades and whatnot. But I think there is something to be said about like having a real freshman year experience. I think matters.
Yeah, I would agree. And then I think there are some like academic things that come from that too. I mean, the social behavior, absolutely. But in 9th grade's the first year that your grades matter.
Right.
So you miss out on that, and then it's really hard to, I think, come out of that mindset.
Well, and they didn't matter again until this year.
Right.
In terms of pass-fail. This is the first year in 3 years that it's not been pass-fail at our school.
So that's tricky as well. And then also just like foundational like study skills as well. Like, you know, in the 9th graders, like learning how to study for a test and how to like write a paper and kind of those things that when you then come to me in 11th grade, I assume that you know. So we don't talk about. I feel like I'm finding myself talking about a lot more.
I think in terms of our specific school and our specific school culture, that's been a really hard part coming back. Like we have a really unique school culture and community here at UMA, and not having the opportunity to like bring students into that from the onset of high school. And because like, again, we did the community days, but we all know those were garbage. We tried hard. I'm not like, we worked really hard to figure out what to do with those days, but they were awful and everybody knows it. And like, and so I think like, especially coming back then, it's like community days matter.
Right.
And how do we get students and families to also believe that they matter and that like advisory like matters and like forming community matters, that like school is more about just showing up. I don't know.
How do we get our English teachers to believe that advisories matter?
I didn't say it. For the record, I'm not one of the English teachers.
I listen, Mr. Johnson's advisory is awesome. We get to have forced fun.
I think there is something to that, though, in all seriousness, in that it's hard to like push back now on the idea of like we almost did too much fun.
Yeah.
It's like a weird way to say it, because we want you all to have fun, but it's like now to be like, hey, we actually aren't going to go outside every day for class. Like, we're going to sit here in the dark and read poetry, and you're going to have to deal with it. I don't know. And then also the other side of that too is I think the COVID is, I mean, it was happening for years, but seeing the like real exponential incline of the teacher shortage coming out of COVID. And you asked about students in particular, and I think even at our school, it's really rough for students who have new teachers every single year. Yeah. It makes it really hard for them to form community and feel connected to the school. Yeah. And I know that people left for a variety of different reasons from here and other places, but COVID was definitely one of those reasons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely.
One other thing that I just want to add to this, I don't remember if it's relevant to this question or a different one, a really big change coming back from COVID that is hard to address is the screen thing, right, for kids, right? Like, y'all spent, like, you were forced to spend, for students, forced to spend 2 years or more, like, staring at a screen, and, like, many of you were locked in your rooms by yourselves with your phones and your laptops, and, like, little to no adult monitoring of that, and then to come back to school, like, I felt very much in a place last year, be like, who the hell am I to tell you not to look at your phone and have your phone out? Like, I've always had a fairly lenient phone policy, because I believe that it's, like, just part of, like, phones are part of our lives, and you need to learn how to use them in moderation, and just saying like no phones is like not realistic in my mind. But like, wow, was that hard coming back, because I didn't even feel like I had a place as a teacher in my, and in my own classroom. Like, it is not even my place to tell you to put your phone away after what you've been through for the last 2 years. And I think at our school, students generally are like pretty good with their phones, but that's not the case in a lot of schools. And there are certainly many students in our school who it continues, like, that's the screen addiction. I am convinced is very, very real. And I think that has been really hard coming back, is like how, dealing with screen addiction. And even feeling like I want to do assignments that, like, I want you to be on the screen, I want you to be typing, and yet, like, I went back to paper-based, a lot more paper-based. I'm doing far more paper-based things now than I was before.
That actually segues really well into a question that we had, which was, how has the pandemic kind of, like, affected how you guys approach your work life?
I think my frustration here, I'll lead us off again, is I think that the pandemic offered an opportunity to learn a lot of lessons. And I think we learned some lessons and we didn't. Like, we've known forever about some of these structural problems in education. The phone thing's been happening since 2010, for example. But it's just the pandemic, coming back from the pandemic, felt like an opportunity to address and fix some of these things. And I'm talking on the school and state and national level. And I think we kind of dropped the ball a bit, again, on a school, state, and national level. I think for me, I don't know. I think, I feel like I have a much shorter temper in staff meetings than I did beforehand. Because we were online. And so when we did a year and a half of staff meetings online. And so now when I have a staff meeting where we have to be there in person, and we don't have to be there in person, if you know what I mean. I feel like
it's frustrating.
I don't know.
I feel like I am much more in a space of like putting more responsibility on students to be like you not like more work and higher expectations, but almost as like, I am here to provide you like an education, and like you need to do, like, if you choose to do it, awesome, and if you choose not to do it, like, I'm not going to fight you on that.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's necessarily a good thing, but I do feel like that's a difference of where I am. I don't know if that's
Mhm.
COVID related or that's just me getting like older and more ornery.
Yeah.
But like I feel like that's a little bit of where I am, is like students need to take more responsibility for their education,
Mhm.
and those that aren't taking that responsibility, like I don't feel like I have the energy to fight that
Yeah.
anymore. And maybe that's a form of compassion fatigue. That's not a phrase that I use very often.
Mhm.
But I can see for me, maybe that's how that's manifested, of like, I put a lot of time and
Yeah.
effort and compassion into this work for a long time. And maybe that's the thing that I lost over COVID, was the ability to like continue to produce the amount of compassion that I had for
Right.
students that are choosing to not engage.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I think the hard part about that is that like that's not necessarily I don't necessarily discriminate on the kids who are choosing not to versus the kids who are facing other things that aren't allowing them to.
Yeah.
But I'm in the mindset, I think I'm being maybe too vulnerable right now. But I'm just in the mindset of like, I can't fight that fight right now. Like I'm here and I'm providing the best education I can. And I just need, like, I need students to decide that this is what they want for themselves. I can't decide that for them.
Yeah.
And I think there's more and more students who are deciding not to take that on for themselves.
Mhm.
That's a big change that I think I've seen too. Is like there's a higher percentage of those students who are not taking that option to learn. And I just don't feel like I have the energy to push that.
I think that valuation thing is dead on for a lot of us. And I think for us in Minnesota, and particularly the Twin Cities, you know, a lot of the COVID timing coincided with the George Floyd pieces as well.
Yeah.
And so that, I don't know, in a way, I think it made me think a little bit more about my subject in terms of like, what matters here for you to have, and maybe the things that I thought before COVID mattered don't matter as much as they actually do.
Yeah.
And then also, I think with what you just mentioned too, of like looking at all the things that are beyond our control, I think is really has been really hard. And I think that was made more clear by COVID in some ways, as we saw like a big gap in equity during that time. And like you said, it becomes hard to be like, there are different reasons students are not here, but I can't control or change those things.
Yeah.
And so then at some point I have to start letting some of that go in order to still be doing what I am doing.
Right.
Otherwise, I'll leave.
Right?
Otherwise, like, you leave the profession. So it is a bit of a self-preservation thing for us personally, but also I think for the profession of teaching. I think one thing that I think there was a lot more conversation around equity over the course of the pandemic. And a lot of that has to do with because of, George Floyd being murdered. We talked a lot about equity among our staff. And I think like one small, it's not a tiny thing, the 4-point grading scale was an effort on our staff's part to move towards being a more equitable grading system. Especially, I know for you as seniors, that's been a frustrating change, and it's not been easy for us as a staff either, and we have not been supported with our technology. But we've been supported with it like as a school and as a staff and whatnot. But like that, the reason why we did that is because of like books that we read over the course of the pandemic that really showed us that like that is a more equitable form of grading. And some of the things that come along with that in terms of like being far more flexible than I think any of us were before the pandemic, like with late work and deadlines. And what's the other piece of that? Late work, deadlines. Retakes. Homework. We don't give homework at UMA anymore. And I don't know if that's necessarily a good or a bad thing. I've always been a big believer of no homework in elementary schools, but I don't know if it's going to be a good thing or a bad thing for students in high school, but it's something that we as a school have decided was like important to us especially as we transition back from COVID,
Yeah.
to help students find more balance and to support students' stress and anxiety levels and ability to experience other things outside of school that are not just focused on school.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is there anything else that you guys would like to bring up and share, or I don't know, put out there before we ask you a smaller final question? Smaller.
I think the another last microcosm that I will bring up, and then I will be quiet, I promise.
It's okay.
Is like we have been talking a lot about the humanities and
Yeah.
the real danger that humanities and I will say the arts are in. And one worry that I have out of COVID is that it was, I think, a little bit easier to keep up STEM during COVID than it was humanities.
Yeah.
Because, and this is not based on anything, because it is humanities and not STEM, which I'm sure they would be quick to point out. But, you know, I think...
A lot easier to send a book home than it is a science experiment.
Yeah. I think a lot of humanities and art is community-based and people-based and conversation-based.
Mm-hmm.
And we're seeing like real world, like a lot of colleges moving away or cutting out humanities programs. And that is really scary to me if that's going to be a lasting impact from COVID as well.
Yeah. Scary to look at going into humanities and possibly teaching.
Well,
It's
and
like a
big
nightmare.
piece of that is like the ability to have an intelligent conversation.
Yeah.
Right? Like, as much as we tried over COVID, I mean, I don't know how many hours I spent looking at a screen of black boxes that were silent.
Yeah.
Right? Like, try as hard as I could to have meaningful conversations. It didn't happen for 2 years.
Yeah.
Kids didn't practice having actual conversations with like backing up their opinions or challenging other people's opinions or even like expressing an opinion, whether it was valid, backed up or not. Like there was just no practice of talking to people for 2 years.
I mean, I know I was
worrisome.
I was guilty of that for a while too, because it was like the Black Lives Matter stuff like is a really good example. Like all of that was happening. And I remember one night I pulled up like a live stream of the riots going on, and I was just sitting there and I'm watching people like make this pile and they're like crashing cars into each other, and I was just watching it and I was like, I used to walk down that street, like, and so it became like, well, what's the point of answering questions online? Like, no, I see the frustration, and I would actually agree with you, Mr. Tyler. I personally had a lot more of an easy time with STEM and math and sciences, but I failed an art class. Like, how do you fail an art class? Like, it was so crazy. And I 100% agree, and thank you for bringing that up. Do you want to ask the final question?
Yeah. Just like, you know, COVID was this massive thing, and it still is. It's still very present. And just like moving forward, what are your guys' outlooks for the future?
Wow, what a question.
Yeah.
we said it was smaller, but...
That was a lie.
Our outlook for the future.
Yeah.
I think that, you know, the hope is, let's be hopeful for the first bit of this, is that we are more prepared for that kind of situation to come up. We have more data. We have a lot of lessons that we've learned and a lot more to be learned, I think, from evaluating that period of time. I think that like the people who are still in education really value being in the classroom in a way that maybe they wouldn't have if we didn't go through COVID. So I think those are all kind of positive outlooks. I think that, again, to bring up Black Lives Matter, that was a weird thing, is I was able to go to a protest at Tuesday at 11 a.m.
Yeah.
And so it gave us a chance to maybe reflect on the values that matter to us, and that's something maybe we can have an outlook going forward as well. And I think the spotlight is on education right now. I don't think it's not all good, that spotlight. A lot of that isn't. But I think that's where we need to keep the spotlight. So I guess that's my outlook going forward of let's keep having those conversations. Let's keep looking at education.
Yeah.
One of the things that I hope continues to come out of this, or does come out of this, but I'm also feeling fairly pessimistic that we've already passed the moment, is recognizing the monumental role that schools play in our society beyond education.
Yeah.
Right? Like, parents, like, had no clue what to do with their kids.
Yeah.
Right? And it's different. Like, we're in high school, so I think it's a little bit different in high school. Like, it was there to an extent, but, like, I mean, so my daughter was an infant when COVID started, and I remember some of my coworkers when COVID started had kids in kindergarten. I'm like, how do you have a kindergartner do online school?
I'll tell you wrestle them into a chair, and it's horrible.
Right, and they get nothing out of it.
Yeah.
It's just torture for everybody.
Yeah.
I didn't experience it, but that's my assumption.
I did.
Right.
Yeah, they just cry.
Right.
Because, like, why would you trap them in one spot to stare at people who they don't even think exist yet?
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that society, I want to believe the society recognize that school plays like a functional babysitting role, like for lots of people, and that it's more than that. Like, I hope that's not all society thinks of us as, like, we're just glorified babysitters.
That could go down some dangerous
roads. In
roads.
reality, like, that's actually a really huge part of what schools do, is they allow families to work, right? Like, so many people, especially women, left the workforce and didn't return when COVID happened because of, like, their children were not in school. And it happened to men too, but disproportionately to women. You know? And so, like, I don't exactly know what I want out of this. Like, what I don't want is for society to think like schools are just babysitters and just daycare, because we're not. But also, I think realizing that they are to an extent, and that is an important and valuable function, and that they start. I mean, I guess it just comes back to this. They start funding it.
Yeah, I was going to say that. Yeah,
right. Like that, they stop
defunding
talking. Yeah, like they start discussing education and like programs. Take like with that in mind, that we are talking about funding free public childcare for ages 5 through 12. And I know the bigger conversation right now is early childhood, and that's super important. Like, my kids' daycare was open throughout the entirety of the pandemic. And
really?
Thank God.
Wow.
Yeah, I think most daycares did stay open. Like, because childcare was different. Like, they're not in teachers' unions, which, like, teachers' unions are a lot of the reasons why a lot of districts stayed closed for as long as they did. Not all, but that's a big reason for it. And they weren't, like, they're not under the same rules as, like, MDE, the Minnesota Department of Education, establishes K through 12 schools. So they didn't have to follow the mandates of being closed or all the other things. So like, I was incredibly grateful, like, to the ends of the earth grateful that, like, her daycare was open the entire time. And just thinking, like, knowing in my mind, like, I know that the people that are taking care of my daughter right now, like, through this licensed daycare program, who are licensed early childhood educators, are paid garbage for this, like, monumentally essential role. And I'm rambling and I don't know my point anymore, but like, just that, like, it's such an important part of society for so many different reasons, and I just hope that we
recognize it.
And I guess part of that is coming a little bit, just to add on a little tail end here, like, my first 2 years in education were when Scott Walker became governor in Wisconsin, and like, he broke the unions, and like, in the town that I the town that I was working in, it wasn't was a small city, I would say. And it was a very blue collar city, and teachers were like public enemy number one.
Yeah.
Like we were just like lambasted in the local newspaper all the time.
Yeah.
It actually makes me like, whether this is right or wrong, it makes me feel very sympathetic a lot of times for police officers right now.
Yeah.
Because I think police officers are like spoken about as this like one group, but they're all the same. And I felt very much so that as a first and second year teacher in that community, being like what we were just talked about as we were like evil people and jealous, or not jealous, what's the word? Selfish.
Yeah.
Corrupting.
Yeah. And so I just hope that we stop politicizing education and recognize that like it is in our society's like best interest. Like talk about the greatest good for the greatest amount of people.
Yeah.
School is where it's at. And we need to start talking about it and putting our money there as if it is that important. Really long answer, sorry.
No, it's okay.
I just wanted on record that I would be a terrible babysitter, and there's no amount of money that you could pay me to do so. Bless those people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Gosh, especially over COVID. Those poor elementary school teachers. Well, thank you so much for making some time to talk to us.
Yeah, thank you. This was
Thank
delightful.
you.
Appreciate the good questions.
Yeah. Well put together.
Yeah, and you can see that we're doing our work, so.